There are ships that sink, there are ships that burn, and then there are ships that simply vanish. Not the vessel itself, but everyone aboard. The Mary Celeste sailed into history on a cold December morning in 1872, and what was found that day has haunted maritime investigators for over 150 years. This is the story of 10 people who stepped off the edge of the world, leaving behind a floating tomb with no bodies, no answers, and no mercy for those of us still searching. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we open a file that the sea has refused to close. The Atlantic Ocean is not a forgiving place. It swallows ships whole, drowns sailors without ceremony, and keeps its secrets in the crushing darkness 2 miles below the surface. But occasionally, just occasionally, the ocean plays a different game. It leaves evidence. It leaves questions. It leaves us a ship, perfectly intact, drifting silent and alone through morning fog, as if everyone aboard had simply decided to walk off the edge of the earth in the middle of the night. That's what Captain David Morehouse saw on December 4th, 1872, approximately 400 nautical miles east of the Azores Islands off the coast of Portugal. His vessel, the British brig Dei Gratia, was making steady progress toward Gibraltar when his helmsman spotted something strange on the horizon. Another ship, listing slightly, sails partially set, but clearly not under anyone's command. The vessel moved erratically, catching wind but following no course, no purpose, no human hand. Morehouse raised his spyglass. The ship was a brigantine, 2-masted, American by the look of her. He'd seen her before. In fact, he'd seen her just over 2 weeks earlier, docked in New York Harbor. It was the Mary Celeste. Under the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man Morehouse knew personally, a fellow master mariner he'd dined with before their respective departures. The Mary Celeste had left New York on November 7th. The Dei Gratia had departed 8 days later on the 15th. By all logic, the Mary Celeste should have been far ahead, well on her way to Genoa, Italy, where she was scheduled to deliver her cargo. But here she was, drifting. No one on deck, no response to signals. Morehouse felt something cold settle in his chest. Something was very wrong. He ordered his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, to take the second mate, John Wright, and 2 crew members across in the ship's boat. The sea was relatively calm that morning, the sky overcast but clear enough for what needed to be done. As the small boat pulled away from the Dei Gratia and approached the Mary Celeste, the 4 men must have called out, their voices carrying across the water. "Hello, the ship. Anyone aboard? Mary Celeste, respond." Nothing. Just the creak of rigging and the slap of waves against the hull. They came alongside. DeVoe grabbed the rail and pulled himself up, Wright following close behind. Their boots hit the deck with hollow thuds that echoed in the emptiness. The ship was completely deserted. But what they found in those first few minutes of exploration was somehow more disturbing than if they'd discovered bodies. Everything was present. The ship had a 6-month supply of food in the galley, untouched. Fresh water in the hold, still drinkable. Crew belongings remained in their quarters, clothing folded, personal effects in place, sea chests closed. In the captain's cabin, toys belonging to a small child sat neatly arranged. A sewing machine had been left out, a vial of oil standing perfectly upright beside it, suggesting the ship hadn't experienced violent trauma. But the people, the 10 souls who had sailed from New York, Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, the 7 experienced crewmen, gone, all of them, vanished as if they'd never existed. If this kind of mystery pulls you in the way it pulls me, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because the files I open here at the Midnight File don't offer easy answers. They offer questions. And sometimes questions are all we have left. Let me take you back to the beginning. To understand what happened aboard the Mary Celeste, we need to understand who was supposed to be there. We need to meet the man at the center of this mystery, Captain Benjamin Briggs. Benjamin Briggs came from maritime royalty. Born in 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, he was the son of Captain Nathan Briggs, himself a respected sea captain who'd commanded vessels for over 4 decades. Benjamin wasn't just born into this life, he was bred for it. Salt water ran in his veins before he could walk. By his early 20s, he'd earned his master's certificate, one of the youngest men of his generation to do so. By his 30s, he was known throughout New England's shipping circles as a captain of impeccable character, deeply religious, temperamental in his sobriety, and fanatical about the safety of his crew and vessel. In 1862, he married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, the daughter of a Congregational church minister. Sarah was educated, cultured, and, unusually for the era, comfortable at sea. She'd accompanied Benjamin on several voyages, keeping journals that survive to this day, documenting life aboard a merchant vessel with a keen eye and a steady hand. By 1872, they had 2 children, their son Arthur, who was 7 years old, and their daughter Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old. That autumn, Benjamin made a business decision. He purchased a significant share in a brigantine called the Mary Celeste, a vessel that had, just a few years earlier, been known by a different name, the Amazon. The ship had been built in 1861 in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, and from the very beginning she'd been marked by tragedy. Her first captain had died during her maiden voyage. She'd run aground, been salvaged, suffered fire damage, and changed hands multiple times, each owner losing money. By the time Briggs bought into her, the vessel had been substantially refitted and renamed, but her reputation lingered like smoke. Still, Briggs was a practical man. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in seamanship, preparation, and the grace of God. He planned this voyage meticulously. The Mary Celeste would carry 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial grade, undrinkable, from New York to Genoa. It was a valuable cargo, but not an unusual one. Alcohol shipments were common, profitable, and if handled correctly, entirely safe. Benjamin made one more decision that would haunt historians for generations. He decided to bring his family. Sarah and little Sophia would accompany him. Arthur would stay behind in Massachusetts to attend school. The captain's cabin was modified to accommodate his wife and daughter, a bed installed, child's toys packed, domestic comforts arranged in the small space that would serve as their home for the 6-week crossing. He assembled his crew with care. 7 men, all experienced, all reportedly of solid character. Albert Richardson, first mate, a seasoned sailor from his home state. Andrew Gilling, second mate. The cook, steward, and 3 able seamen whose names were recorded in the ship's registry. None of them had criminal records. None were known for violence or unreliability. These were working men, professionals, the kind who'd crossed the Atlantic dozens of times and would cross it dozens more. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed New York Harbor. Captain David Morehouse, commanding the Dei Gratia, was still in port, preparing his own vessel for a similar route. The 2 captains had shared a meal the night before. They'd discussed navigation, weather patterns, the best course to take given the season. Morehouse would later testify that Briggs seemed in excellent spirits, confident in his ship and his crew, looking forward to the voyage. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The Mary Celeste made good time despite encountering harsh weather as she pushed east across the Atlantic. Captain Briggs maintained his ship's log with meticulous care, recording positions, wind conditions, sail configurations, all the tedious but essential data that marked a professional captain's attention to detail. The entries were calm, routine, almost boring in their precision. The last entry was made on November 25, 1872. The Mary Celeste was approximately 6 nautical miles from Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The log noted their position, the weather conditions, rough seas, but nothing beyond a capable ship's handling, and the routine operations of the day. There was no indication of distress, no mention of emergency, no hint that anything was wrong. And then, silence. The log simply stopped. No further entries, no explanation, nothing. Whatever happened next occurred in the span of 9 days. 9 days during which the Mary Celeste continued to sail, presumably with no one at the helm, drifting on currents and catching wind, moving erratically across 400 miles of open ocean, until Captain Morehouse spotted her that December morning. When Oliver Deveau completed his initial survey of the abandoned ship and reported back to Captain Morehouse, his findings painted a picture that was simultaneously mundane and profoundly disturbing. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy. Her hull was intact. No major damage, no breaches that would threaten her flotation. But there was water in the hold, approximately 3.5 feet, and one of the ship's 2 pumps had been disassembled, its components lying scattered as if someone had been trying desperately to repair or clean it. The cargo hold told its own strange story. Of the 1,701 barrels of alcohol, most remained secured and sealed, but 9 barrels were empty, completely empty. And there were clear signs that cargo had shifted during rough weather. Barrels rubbing against each other, seams possibly cracking, vapors potentially escaping into the confined space below deck. The ship's navigation instruments were missing. Captain Briggs's sextant, his chronometer, the ship's official register, all gone. This suggested intention, not panic. Someone had made the decision to take these specific items you'd need if you were planning to navigate in a small boat. And the boat. The Mary Celeste carried a single lifeboat, and it was gone. Not torn away by storm, not smashed by waves. The rope that had secured it had been cut cleanly, deliberately, as if someone had taken a knife or axe to it in a hurry, unable or unwilling to waste time untying the knots. In the captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs's belongings remained untouched. Sophia's toys, the sewing machine, a bottle of cough medicine sitting upright on a shelf. The bed was unmade, as if people had just risen from sleep. In the galley there was food, not fresh meals still warm, that's a myth we'll address shortly, but supplies. Flour, salt pork, hardtack, all the standard provisions of a merchant vessel. Nothing had been ransacked. Nothing had been consumed in a frenzied panic. The crew quarters told the same story. Personal effects remained. Clothing, pipes, the small treasures that sailors carried with them across the ocean. None of it had been taken. These men hadn't packed. They hadn't prepared for a long abandonment. They'd simply left. The wheel was unlocked, free to spin, which meant the ship had been sailing herself for days, catching wind randomly, drifting wherever current and chance took her. The binnacle, the compass housing, had been knocked out of place. Some of the rigging had been damaged, sails torn, but this could easily be explained by days of unmanned sailing through rough Atlantic weather. But here's what really disturbed Oliver Deveau as he stood on that empty deck. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage consistent with violence, no indication that anything terrible had happened aboard this ship. The Mary Celeste wasn't a crime scene. She was just abandoned. Captain Morehouse faced a decision. Maritime law was clear on such matters. A derelict vessel found at sea could be claimed as salvage, and the salvaging crew was entitled to compensation, often a substantial percentage of the combined value of the ship and cargo. But Morehouse also knew Captain Briggs personally. He knew this man's family was aboard, and somewhere in the back of his mind he must have wondered, could they still be alive? Could they be drifting in that lifeboat, waiting for rescue? He made the only decision he could. He ordered Deveau to take 2 men and sail the Mary Celeste to the nearest port, while the Dei Gratia continued under his own command. It was a risky move, splitting his crew, sending 3 men to sail a larger vessel that had been found abandoned under mysterious circumstances. But it was the right thing to do. If there was any chance of finding survivors, they needed to get help quickly. For 8 days, the 2 ships sailed together, maintaining visual contact when possible, and on December 13, 1872, they both dropped anchor in Gibraltar Harbor. What happened next would transform a maritime mystery into a scandal that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. If you're still with me, if this story has its hooks in you the way it has its hooks in me, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened, because we're about to enter the ugliest chapter of this case, the one where grief and mystery get buried under suspicion and greed. The salvage hearings began on December 17, 1872, under Chief Justice Sir James Cochrane of the Gibraltar Vice Admiralty Court. Under normal circumstances, these hearings would be straightforward. A derelict vessel had been found and properly salvaged. The salvaging crew would give testimony, the ship and cargo would be evaluated, and a fair percentage would be awarded. The process was routine, established by centuries of maritime law. But nothing about the Mary Celeste would be routine. The driving force behind what became less a hearing and more an inquisition was Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar. Solly Flood was a man of strong convictions and stronger suspicions. From the moment he heard about the Mary Celeste, he became convinced that serious offences had been committed. Not an accident, not a tragedy, a calculated act. His theory was lurid, sensational, and completely unsupported by evidence. He believed the crew had gotten into the ship's alcohol cargo, become intoxicated, and then carried out acts of violence against Captain Briggs, his wife, his daughter, and the officers before abandoning the ship. In his mind, this was the only explanation for why experienced sailors would leave a perfectly seaworthy vessel. To support this theory, Solly Flood ordered extensive examinations of the Mary Celeste. Surveyor John Austin was brought in to inspect every inch of the ship's hull and deck, and Austin found, or claimed to find, evidence that seemed to support the Attorney General's dark imagination. He reported cuts on the bow, deliberate marks made with a sharp instrument. He found stains on the deck and on Captain Briggs's sword that might be blood. The Royal Navy sent their own examiners, and they allegedly endorsed Austin's findings, noting what appeared to be an axe mark on one of the rails. Solly Flood took this further. He began to suspect not just the Mary Celeste's crew, but the crew of the Dei Grazia. Perhaps Captain Morehouse's men had encountered the Mary Celeste at sea and carried out acts of violence to claim the salvage reward. Or perhaps there was collusion. Perhaps Morehouse and Briggs had planned this together, an elaborate insurance fraud scheme orchestrated by James Winchester, the Mary Celeste's owner back in New York. The implications were devastating. Captain Morehouse, who had done everything correctly, who had followed maritime law to the letter, who had risked his own men to bring a derelict vessel to port, suddenly found himself under suspicion. His crew was interrogated repeatedly, their testimonies picked apart for inconsistencies. The men who had first boarded the Mary Celeste were treated not as heroes, but as potential perpetrators. For weeks, the hearings dragged on, theories multiplied, accusations flew, and through it all one question hung in the air. Where were the bodies? If violence had occurred aboard the Mary Celeste, where was the physical evidence? Where were Captain Briggs, Sarah, Sophia, and the 7 crew members? The answer would come not from testimony but from science. Chemical analysis of the supposed bloodstains revealed they weren't blood at all. They were rust. The reddish-brown marks on the deck and the captain's sword were simply oxidation, the natural result of iron exposed to salt air and moisture. No blood, no violence. Captain Shufelt of the United States Navy was brought in to examine the cuts on the bow that John Austin had identified as deliberate marks. Schufelt's conclusion was unequivocal. These weren't man-made. They were natural results of the sea's action on wooden timbers, the kind of wear and weathering that any vessel of the Mary Celeste's age would exhibit. The wood had split along its grain, water had penetrated cracks, ice had formed and expanded during cold Atlantic nights. There was nothing sinister about these marks, nothing deliberate. The axe mark on the rail, likely made during routine maintenance. Sailors often used hand tools to make repairs at sea, and marks on wooden rails were common, unremarkable. One by one, Solly Flood's dramatic theories collapsed under the weight of actual evidence. There had been no violence aboard the Mary Celeste, no drunken rampage, no calculated act. The ship had been abandoned, yes, but abandoned by people who believed, rightly or wrongly, that their lives were in immediate danger. On February 25, 1873, the court released the Mary Celeste from its jurisdiction. The salvage award granted to Captain Morehouse and his crew was £1,700, approximately 1/5 of the combined value of the ship and cargo. This was far less than they deserved for such a hazardous salvage operation, and the reduced amount carried an implicit message. Chief Justice Cochrane, while unable to prove wrongdoing, still harbored suspicions. Captain Morehouse took his money and tried to move on with his life, but the damage was done. His reputation had been tarnished by association with the Mary Celeste, and for the families of those lost, for Benjamin Briggs's mother, his brother, Sarah's relatives, there was no closure, just questions. Just the terrible knowledge that their loved ones had vanished, and no one could explain why. The Mary Celeste was returned to her owner, James Winchester, and sailed back to New York. But the ship that entered New York Harbor in the spring of 1873 was no longer just a merchant vessel. She was cursed. That's what the sailors said. That's what the dockworkers whispered as she rotted at anchor, unwanted, avoided like a plague ship. Because everyone who touched the Mary Celeste seemed to suffer for it, and the ship's own fate would prove stranger than anyone could imagine. But before we get to that, we need to address the question that's been haunting this case for 150 years. What actually happened out there? What could make 10 people abandon a seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Share this video with someone who loves mysteries, because what comes next is where speculation meets science, and where the truth might actually be more terrifying than any fiction. In the century and a half since the Mary Celeste was found drifting, theories have proliferated like barnacles on a shipwreck. Some are plausible, many are absurd, a few are genuinely disturbing in their implications. The wildest theories can be dismissed quickly. No, the crew was not attacked by a giant sea creature. Despite Victorian sensationalism, there's no evidence of any kind of marine animal attack. The ship's hull was intact, the rigging undamaged in ways that would indicate tentacles or teeth. No, a waterspout, a maritime tornado, didn't lift everyone off the deck. Waterspouts are visible from miles away and would have been noted in the ship's log. And no, the crew didn't fall victim to pirates. Pirates take cargo, valuables, anything they can sell. The Mary Celeste's cargo was largely intact, and items of value remained aboard. Earthquake. The Azores region does experience seismic activity, but an earthquake severe enough to panic an experienced captain would have caused visible damage to the ship's structure. There was none. Supernatural phenomena. I don't traffic in ghosts here at the Midnight File. We deal in human stories, human decisions, human tragedies. Whatever happened to the Mary Celeste, it happened in the real world, governed by the laws of physics and probability. So let's focus on the theories that actually make sense, the theories that maritime historians, naval architects, and scientists have spent decades investigating. The most compelling modern theory centers on the ship's cargo: 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial strength, highly volatile. And as Oliver Deveau discovered when he first boarded the abandoned ship, 9 of those barrels were completely empty. In 2005, Dr. Andrea Seller of University College London conducted a remarkable experiment. He wanted to test whether an explosion could occur in the Mary Celeste's hold without leaving visible evidence of fire. Using a replica of the ship's cargo area, he filled the space with butane gas to simulate alcohol vapors and placed paper cubes to represent wooden barrels. Then he ignited it. The result was spectacular. A massive fireball erupted, flames shooting upward in a pressure wave explosion that would have blown open the cargo hatch and sent a column of fire into the sky. But here's the critical detail. When the smoke cleared, there was no scorching, no burn marks, no soot. The paper cubes, despite being at the center of an explosion, were unsinged. This type of pressure wave explosion creates intense heat and force, but only for a fraction of a second, not long enough to ignite materials that don't catch immediately. Now imagine you're Captain Benjamin Briggs. You're a religious man, a careful man, a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. Your wife is below deck with your 2-year-old daughter. It's late November, the weather has been rough, and you've been fighting Atlantic storms for 2 weeks. You know you have volatile cargo in your hold. You've been on ships carrying alcohol before. You understand the risks. Then, without warning, there's a sound like thunder from below deck. The cargo hatch blows open. Flames shoot 30 feet into the air. The entire forward section of your ship is engulfed in a fireball that lasts only seconds but seems to last forever. The fire vanishes as quickly as it appeared. But you don't know that's going to happen. In that moment, all you know is your ship is exploding, your wife and daughter are aboard, and you have seconds to make a decision. You order everyone into the lifeboat. You grab your sextant, your chronometer, the ship's register, the items you'll need to navigate if you end up adrift. You don't take food because you're not planning to be gone long. You're just getting away from the ship until you can assess the danger. You're planning to tie the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste and observe from a safe distance. If the ship doesn't explode again, if she doesn't catch fire and burn to the waterline, you'll reboard. You'll continue to Genoa. This theory is supported by multiple factors. First, the barrels themselves. Records show that many of the alcohol barrels were constructed from red oak rather than white oak. Red oak is more porous, more prone to leaking vapors. When cargo shifts in rough seas, barrels rub together, seams crack, alcohol escapes as liquid and evaporates into the confined space of the hold. All it takes is a single spark, friction between two barrels, a lantern knocked over, even static electricity in the dry air, and you have the conditions for an explosion. Second, the missing lifeboat rope. The rope had been cut, not untied. This suggests haste, but also suggests the rope was under tension when it was cut. Perhaps the ship had been moving, the lifeboat dragging behind, and the rope needed to be severed quickly. Third, the disassembled pump. This detail becomes crucial when combined with another discovery made during the investigation. Comparing Soliflood's court notes with modern oceanographic data, researchers found something disturbing. The Mary Celeste was approximately 120 miles west of where Captain Briggs believed she was. His calculations were wrong. His chronometer was faulty. For a captain of Briggs's experience and precision, discovering a navigational error of that magnitude would have been profoundly disorienting. Everything he thought he knew about his position, his distance from land, his course to safety, all of it was wrong. And he would have realized this around the time the ship approached the Azores, around the time the last log entry was made. Now add the pump problem. The Mary Celeste had recently undergone extensive refitting. She'd previously carried coal, and coal dust is insidious. It gets into every crack, every seam, every mechanical component. Both the ship's pumps were likely clogged with coal dust and construction debris from the refitting. With one pump already disassembled, Briggs had no reliable way to measure the water accumulating in the hold. He couldn't determine if his ship was taking on water faster than normal. He couldn't assess whether the Mary Celeste was slowly sinking. Imagine the accumulation of problems facing Captain Briggs in those final hours. Rough seas, navigational confusion, a pump system he couldn't trust, water in the hold that he couldn't accurately measure, and a volatile cargo that had already leaked enough to leave 9 barrels empty. Then an explosion, or what sounded like one, or what could have been one. In that moment, with his family's lives at stake, what would you do? He made the decision that maritime experts in retrospect say was tragically wrong. He ordered the ship abandoned. The crew took the lifeboat. They brought the rope to tether themselves to the Mary Celeste. They took navigation tools and important documents, but they didn't properly provision the lifeboat because they weren't planning an extended voyage. They were planning a temporary evacuation, a cautious retreat to observe and assess. And here's where the tragedy turns heartbreaking. At some point, whether through wave action, the ship's movement, or a panicked decision when the lifeboat began taking on water in rough seas, the rope was cut or broke free. The Mary Celeste, freed from the lifeboat's drag, caught the wind and began moving. Faster than a small boat could row, faster than desperate men could paddle. The last log entry placed the ship approximately 6 miles from Santa Maria Island, close enough that Briggs might have believed they could reach land if necessary, close enough to seem safe. But 6 miles in a lifeboat, in rough Atlantic seas, with limited provisions and potentially limited rowing capacity if the boat was taking on water. 6 miles becomes an impossible distance. The Mary Celeste sailed away, and Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs watched his ship, his investment, his livelihood, the vessel he'd modified to carry his family in comfort, disappear over the horizon. He was left in a small boat with his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crewmen, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, with the coastline of an island they would never reach shimmering in the distance. Maritime historians believe the lifeboat either capsized in rough seas, likely given the weather conditions that week, or drifted into the vast Atlantic, where the occupants succumbed to exposure, dehydration, and starvation. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies ever recovered. The ocean kept them the way it keeps so many who trust their lives to the mercy of wind and water. And the terrible irony? The Mary Celeste didn't sink, didn't explode, didn't burn. She sailed on empty and alone, a ghost ship carrying everything her crew left behind, until Captain Morehouse spotted her 9 days later. If this file stays with you the way it stays with me, take a moment and like this video. Because the story isn't over. the Mary Celeste's curse was only beginning. The mystery of the Mary Celeste would have remained a maritime tragedy, a professional discussion among sailors and historians, if not for one man, Arthur Conan Doyle. In January 1884, 12 years after the ship was found abandoned, a short story appeared in the Cornhill magazine, one of Britain's most prestigious literary publications. The story was titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement and was published anonymously. It purported to be the first-person account of a survivor from a ship called the Mary Celeste. Note the slightly different spelling, and it was explicitly based on the Mary Celeste case. But Doyle, who would go on to create Sherlock Holmes and become one of the most famous writers in the English language, did what writers do. He embellished, he dramatized, he invented details that were more compelling than the truth. In Doyle's version, the ship was found in perfect condition. Meals were still warm on the table, fires burned in the galley, fresh tobacco smoke lingered in the cabin, as if the crew had been smoking their pipes just moments before vanishing. A cat was found sleeping peacefully in the galley, and a chicken was sitting on some eggs. The ship's boats were all present and secured. There was no evidence of why anyone would have left. These details are fiction, complete fiction. But they were so much more interesting than the actual facts that they became embedded in popular memory. For over a century, people have repeated Doyle's inventions as if they were historical truth. The warm meals, the burning fires, the idyllic scene of peaceful abandonment, even the name stuck. Many people still refer to the ship as the Mary Celeste, Doyle's romantic French spelling, rather than the correct Mary Celeste. Doyle's story also introduced various speculative theories. Perhaps the crew had been taken by an African secret society, perhaps there was a racial conflict aboard, perhaps supernatural forces were at work. None of this had any basis in the historical record, but it sold magazines, it captured imaginations, it turned a maritime mystery into a cultural phenomenon, and it ensured that the real story, the probable tragedy of a careful captain making a panicked decision that cost him and his family their lives, would be forever obscured by mythology. The Mary Celeste herself, meanwhile, returned to service under a cloud of suspicion and superstition. She rotted at anchor in New York for months before anyone would buy her. Finally sold at a significant loss, she sailed primarily West Indian and Indian Ocean routes, consistently losing money for her new owners. The curse, sailors said. The ship was cursed. In February 1879, while anchored at St. Helena, the Mary Celeste's captain, Edgar Toothill, fell ill and died on the island. He was the third captain associated with the ship to pass away prematurely. The crew refused to sail with the vessel. They had to be replaced entirely before she could leave port. The final chapter of the Mary Celeste story is almost poetically ironic. In 1884, the same year Doyle's story was published, Captain Gilman C. Parker took command. Parker was not a man of Captain Briggs's character. He was, to put it bluntly, a criminal, and he saw the Mary Celeste not as a ship, but as an opportunity. Parker and a group of conspirators based in Boston hatched a plan. They loaded the Mary Celeste's hold with worthless junk, old boots, rotted lumber, garbage that had no value whatsoever, but they listed valuable goods on the manifest. Fine furniture, quality textiles, expensive merchandise. They insured the cargo for $30,000, an enormous sum at the time. Then Parker deliberately sailed the Mary Celeste onto a reef off the coast of Haiti and wrecked her. The plan was simple: claim the insurance, walk away with the money, and let the ship sink into obscurity. But the fraud was too obvious. The insurance company sent investigators. The worthless cargo was discovered. Parker and his co-conspirators were arrested and tried. Parker's legal career was destroyed. He died shortly after in poverty and disgrace. The ship that had survived the Atlantic survived abandonment, survived years of superstitious crews and bad luck, ended her days as evidence in a fraud case, rotting on a Haitian reef until the sea finally pulled her apart. It was an ignoble end for a vessel that had, through no fault of her own, become the most famous ghost ship in maritime history. Leave a comment below if you think the Mary Celeste was cursed, or if you believe, like I do, that curses are just stories we tell when we can't accept that sometimes tragedy needs no reason. The cultural impact of the Mary Celeste extends far beyond maritime history. The mystery has inspired countless books, at least a dozen films, numerous television documentaries, and even scientific terminology. Colony collapse disorder, the phenomenon where honeybees mysteriously abandon their hives while leaving the queen and food behind, is sometimes informally called Mary Celeste syndrome by researchers who see parallels in the inexplicable abandonment. Throughout the 20th century, Victorian spiritualists claimed to have contacted the crew through seances. They reported messages from Captain Briggs, from Sarah, even from little Sophia, all describing various fates ranging from pirate attack to being swept overboard by a freak wave. None of these accounts match each other, and none provide verifiable information that wasn't already public knowledge. Gothic authors employed the Mary Celeste in their fiction, transforming her into a vessel cursed by ancient powers or haunted by the restless dead. Science fiction writers proposed alien abduction. Conspiracy theorists suggested the ship had passed through a rift in time or dimension. The mystery became a blank canvas onto which people projected their own fears, their own fascinations with the unknown. Modern documentarians continue investigating the case with 21st century technology. Oceanographers have mapped the currents where the Mary Celeste was found, determining where a small boat might have drifted. Meteorologists have reconstructed the weather patterns for November 1872, confirming that rough seas would have made lifeboat travel extremely hazardous. Chemists have replicated the conditions in the ship's hold, demonstrating how alcohol vapors could have created an explosion without leaving burn marks. And yet, despite all this investigation, despite all the scientific analysis and historical research, we cannot say with absolute certainty what happened. We cannot recover the Mary Celeste's lifeboat from the ocean floor. We cannot interview the crew. We cannot ask Captain Briggs why he made the decision he made. All we have are the facts: a seaworthy ship, abandoned voluntarily, drifting empty across 400 miles of ocean. 10 people who left behind everything they owned and stepped into a small boat that would become their coffin. A mystery that refuses to close, but here's what we do know. We know Captain Benjamin Briggs was a good man. Every account of his character supports this. His family loved him. His crews respected him. He was religious, sober, careful in his duties. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't a fool. Whatever decision he made in those final moments aboard the Mary Celeste, he made it believing he was protecting his wife and daughter. We know Sarah Briggs was intelligent and competent. Her journals reveal a woman who understood the sea, who'd made multiple voyages, who wasn't prone to panic. If she agreed to abandon the ship, she did so because her husband convinced her it was necessary. We know the crew were experienced professionals. These weren't novices or troublemakers. They were working men who'd sailed the Atlantic before and understood the risks of both staying aboard a potentially compromised vessel and taking to a lifeboat in rough seas. And we know that somewhere in the final calculation, weighing the known dangers against unknown ones, measuring fear against hope, these 10 people chose the lifeboat. They chose what they believed was safety. And they were wrong. The Mary Celeste teaches us something about the nature of decisions made in crisis. It reminds us that experience doesn't guarantee correct judgment when panic intrudes, that even the most careful planning can unravel in moments of terror, that sometimes the choice that seems most rational, most necessary, most obviously correct, leads directly to catastrophe. Captain Morehouse, who discovered the ship, who did everything right, who followed maritime law precisely, spent the rest of his life answering questions about whether he'd been involved in some sinister plot. His reward for doing his duty was suspicion, reduced salvage payment, and a reputation forever connected to tragedy. He didn't deserve that. But the Mary Celeste destroyed reputations the way she destroyed her own crew. James Winchester, the ship's owner, lost his investment and gained nothing but headaches and legal troubles. The ship he'd purchased as a business venture became a liability he couldn't escape. Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General who pursued his conspiracy theories so aggressively, was eventually proven wrong on every substantive claim. The blood wasn't blood. The deliberate cuts weren't deliberate. The elaborate theories of drunken violence and insurance fraud collapsed under examination. But by then, the damage was done. The Mary Celeste had been tried in the court of public opinion and found guilty of something. No one could say exactly what, but the stain remained. And Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote his fictionalized account with no malicious intent, inadvertently buried the truth under layers of romantic invention. His warm meals and burning fires and peaceful abandonment became the story people remembered, making the real mystery, the probable panic, the explosive vapor, the desperate evacuation, seem mundane by comparison. The truth is often less interesting than fiction, but it's also more tragic, because the truth suggests that Captain Briggs did exactly what any loving father, any responsible captain, any decent human being would do when faced with what appeared to be imminent catastrophe. He saved his family, he saved his crew. He made the decision that seemed right in that moment of terror. And it was the worst decision he ever made. Think about that for a moment. Think about the seconds ticking by as the lifeboat drifted farther from the Mary Celeste. Think about the moment when Briggs realized the rope had separated and the ship was pulling away. Think about him reaching for his daughter, holding his wife, watching his vessel, his home, his livelihood, his connection to civilization, disappear into the Atlantic haze. Think about the slow understanding that would have crept over him in the hours that followed. The realization that the ship wasn't sinking, that whatever explosion or sound or terror had driven them off the Mary Celeste, it hadn't destroyed her. That if they'd just waited, if they'd just stayed aboard, if they'd just trusted the vessel beneath their feet, they would have been fine. Think about the first night in that lifeboat, the cold Atlantic wind, the stars overhead, beautiful and indifferent. Sophia crying, not understanding why they were in this small boat, instead of the warm cabin she knew. Sarah trying to stay calm, trying to comfort her daughter, trying to support her husband, even as fear gnawed at her own heart. The 7 crewmen experienced enough to know their situation, but unable to do anything except row toward an island they would never reach. Think about the second day, the third, the growing thirst, the realization that they'd left the ship's supplies behind, the understanding that Santa Maria Island, visible on that last morning when the log was written, was no longer in sight, that they were lost in the Atlantic, in a boat designed for short-range transport, not open ocean survival. Think about how it ended. Whether the lifeboat capsized in storm waves, dumping everyone into water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes, whether they drifted for days, dying slowly from dehydration and exposure, whether sharks came drawn by desperation and the scent of people too weak to resist, or whether they simply faded one by one until the last survivor, perhaps Briggs himself, perhaps one of the crew, sat alone in a boat with the dead waiting for an end that would be a mercy. We don't know. The ocean keeps its secrets, but we know they died. All of them. Captain Benjamin Briggs, age 37, who came from a maritime family and believed he was making the right choice. Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, age 30, who'd kept journals during her voyages and saw the world with curious eyes. Sophia Matilda Briggs, age 2, who never got to grow up, never got to understand why the warm ship became a cold boat, became nothing at all. Albert Richardson, Andrew Gilling, and 5 other men whose families waited for them in ports they would never reach. 10 lives, 10 stories, 10 people who woke up on November 25th, 1872, not knowing it would be one of their last mornings alive. This is what haunts me about the Mary Celeste, not the empty ship, not the maritime mystery, not the theories or the investigations or the cultural impact. What haunts me is the human cost, the realization that this wasn't a supernatural event or an elaborate conspiracy. It was a tragedy born from a moment of fear, a decision made with incomplete information, a father trying to protect his family in the only way he knew how. Captain Briggs couldn't have known that the explosion, if there was one, was a pressure wave phenomenon that would leave no lasting damage. He couldn't have known that his chronometer was faulty and his ship was far from where he believed. He couldn't have known that the pump problems were temporary, that the water in the hold wasn't rising dangerously. He had seconds to decide, and he decided based on what seemed true in that moment. And he was wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, the kind of wrong that ends in the Atlantic Ocean swallowing 10 people without a trace. If you're still watching, if this story has traveled with you through these past 60 minutes, do something for me. Subscribe to the Midnight File. because we need to remember stories like this, not as entertainment, not as puzzles to solve, but as reminders of our own fragility, as evidence that even the most competent among us can make fatal errors when fear overwhelms judgment. The Mary Celeste has had a strange afterlife in human consciousness. She's become shorthand for mysterious disappearance, for questions without answers. When people want to describe something inexplicably abandoned, they invoke her name. She appears in novels, films, television shows, always as a ghost, always as a vessel touched by something beyond understanding. But the real Mary Celeste wasn't mystical. She was a working merchant ship, 100 feet long, built from Nova Scotia timber, registered in the United States, owned by businessmen looking to turn a profit carrying cargo across the Atlantic. She had no special properties, no cursed history that should have warned anyone away. She was just a ship, doing what ships do, until the day her crew made a decision that turned her into history's most famous maritime mystery. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. The extraordinary often emerges from the ordinary. The memorable comes from the mundane. Captain Briggs wasn't trying to create a mystery. He was trying to save his family. The crew wasn't attempting to leave a puzzle for future generations. They were attempting to survive what they believed was a catastrophe. They failed. And in failing, they created something that has outlived them by more than a century. Their names are known to historians and true crime enthusiasts worldwide. Their disappearance has been analyzed, theorized about, dramatized and discussed in dozens of languages across 6 continents. They became famous in the worst possible way and famous for vanishing. I think about Benjamin Briggs sometimes. In those quiet hours before dawn, when sleep refuses to come and old files drift through my mind like ships through fog, I think about what he might have said in those final moments in the lifeboat. Did he apologize to Sarah? Did he promise Sophia that everything would be fine, knowing it was a lie? Did he pray, calling on the God he'd worshipped so devoutly throughout his life, asking for deliverance that would never come? Or did he sit in silence, watching the Mary Celeste shrink into the distance, understanding with terrible clarity that he'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone? That maritime rescue in 1872 wasn't coming, that no one knew where they were, that the ocean doesn't care about good intentions or careful planning or the love between a father and his daughter. The ocean just takes, and it took them all. There's a particular cruelty in the way this story unfolds. If the Mary Celeste had sunk, if she'd gone down with all hands in a storm, there would be tragedy but not mystery. Ships sank, sailors drowned. It was the risk they accepted when they signed on for a voyage. Families would mourn, but they would understand. Instead, the ship survived. She sailed on, empty and pristine, carrying evidence of ordinary life suddenly interrupted. She forced everyone who heard about her to ask why. What could make experienced sailors abandon a seaworthy vessel? What terror could be so overwhelming that staying aboard seemed more dangerous than taking to a lifeboat in the Atlantic? And because we don't have definitive answers, because we only have theories and probabilities and scientific experiments conducted over a century later, the questions persist. They echo through time like the creaking of the Mary Celeste's rigging on that December morning when Captain Morehouse first spotted her. The case has been officially closed for over 150 years. No crime was committed. No insurance fraud was proven. No conspiracy existed. The Gibraltar court released the ship. The salvage was paid. Captain Morehouse went on with his life, though forever marked by his association with the mystery. The Mary Celeste returned to service, became a fraud vehicle, and ultimately rotted away on a Caribbean reef. But the file in my mind remains open. Because closure requires answers, and the Mary Celeste refuses to provide them. We can theorize about alcohol vapors and pressure explosions. We can examine pump failures and navigation errors. We can reconstruct weather patterns and chart ocean currents. But we cannot bring back the voices of the 10 people who left that ship on or around November 25th, 1872. We cannot ask them, what did you see? What did you hear? What convinced you that staying aboard meant certain doom while leaving meant possible survival? In that moment of decision, what tipped the scales? These questions will haunt maritime historians forever. They'll haunt me. And if you've listened to this entire story, If you've traveled with me through the details of this case, they'll probably haunt you too, because that's what a true mystery does. It doesn't let go, it stays with you. It makes you wonder, late at night when you're alone with your thoughts, what you would have done in Captain Briggs's position. Would you have stayed aboard, trusting the ship despite apparent disaster? Or would you have made the same choice he made, the choice that seemed right, the choice that killed everyone you loved? There's no judgment here, no condemnation. Captain Briggs was a victim, not a villain. He died trying to protect his family. That's not a failure of character. That's not negligence or incompetence. That's a man making the best decision he could with the information he had in the time available. It was just the wrong decision. And in the unforgiving mathematics of the Atlantic Ocean, wrong decisions don't come with second chances. I want to show you something, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Close your eyes. Well, it's after you finish watching this, obviously. But close your eyes and picture the Mary Celeste, not the ship as she appeared in dramatic paintings or as Doyle described her. Picture the real ship, the actual brigantine. She's drifting. The sails are partially set, catching wind inconsistently, causing the vessel to move erratically. Water sloshes in the hold, not enough to sink her, but enough to make the boards creak. The wheel turns slowly, responding to currents rather than any human hand. Below deck, in the captain's cabin, Sophia's toys sit where Sarah left them. The sewing machine waits for hands that will never return. The ship's log ends mid-voyage, mid-story, mid-life. Now picture the lifeboat somewhere out there in the Atlantic. 10 people crowded into a space designed for temporary use, watching their ship sail away, watching their supplies, their shelter, their salvation disappear over the horizon. And around them, nothing but water. Water to every edge of vision. Water cold and deep and indifferent to their suffering. One of these images is peaceful, almost romantic, an empty ship, a maritime ghost, drifting through history and mythology. The other is horror, pure, undiluted human horror, the kind that doesn't make for good entertainment, so we tend not to dwell on it. But we should dwell on it. We should remember that behind every mystery, there are real people who suffered real deaths. That the Mary Celeste isn't just a puzzle, she's a floating tomb, a monument to the final moments of 10 people who deserved better than the hand they were dealt. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the fragility of human decision-making and the cruelty of circumstance, take a moment and share this video. Send it to someone who appreciates stories that don't have clean endings, someone who understands that the most haunting mysteries are the ones where we know almost everything except the one thing that matters most. The Mary Celeste has been gone for over a century. She disintegrated on that Haitian reef in the 1880s, her timbers scattered by waves, her wood and metal reclaimed by the Caribbean Sea. You cannot visit her. You cannot touch her. She exists now only in historical records, in court documents, in ship registries and salvage hearings. But her story persists. It persists because it represents something fundamental about the human experience, the uncertainty we face when making critical decisions, the gap between intention and outcome, the reality that doing everything right can still lead to catastrophic failure. Captain David Morehouse lived until 1902. He commanded other vessels, made other voyages, had a long career at sea. But when people asked him about his life, when they wanted to hear his stories, they always came back to that December morning in 1872, when he spotted a ship drifting off the Portuguese coast. That single day defined his legacy more than decades of competent, professional seamanship. The families of the crew never received closure. They never recovered bodies. They never learned exactly what happened. Benjamin's mother lived for many years after her son's disappearance, always wondering, always hoping that maybe somehow he'd survived. Maybe he'd been picked up by another ship. Maybe he'd lost his memory but was alive somewhere. She died not knowing. Sarah's relatives held on to the same impossible hope. That's another cruelty of this case. The not knowing. The inability to properly grieve because there's always that tiny irrational possibility that answers might still come. That evidence might surface. That the ocean might give back what it took. But the ocean never gives back. It only takes. And it took the Mary Celeste's crew into depths where human remains don't last long, where fish and crabs and natural decay erase evidence within days. Even if someone had found the lifeboat floating empty weeks later, It would have told them nothing useful. Just another small boat lost at sea, one of thousands that disappeared in the age of sail. The alcohol cargo that Captain Briggs was transporting eventually made it to Genoa, though delayed and under different management. Someone in Italy received their shipment of industrial denatured alcohol and used it for whatever industrial purposes they'd planned. They probably never knew about the ship's strange history, probably never learned that their cargo had been aboard a vessel that would become legendary. And maybe that's fitting. Life continues. Business proceeds. The world doesn't stop because 10 people died in the Atlantic. Their tragedy, which dominated their own existence, was barely a footnote in the commercial transaction that had brought the Mary Celeste across the ocean in the first place. This is what true crime teaches us if we're paying attention, that every cold case, every unsolved mystery, every disappearance represents real people whose lives mattered far more to them than they matter to history. That we tell these stories not just because they're interesting, though they are, but because someone needs to remember, someone needs to say the names: Benjamin, Sarah, Sophia, Albert, Andrew. The others whose names appeared in the ship's registry and then vanished from all records except the dusty court documents in Gibraltar. They deserved better. They deserved to reach Genoa safely, to return to their families, to live out their natural lives and die in beds surrounded by loved ones, not in a lifeboat surrounded by cold Atlantic water. But they didn't get what they deserved. And that's the tragedy that echoes across 150 years. Before we close this file, I want to address something. Throughout this story, I've focused on the most probable explanation: the explosion theory, the panic, the tragic evacuation. And I believe that's likely what happened. The evidence supports it. The science demonstrates it's possible. The timeline fits. But I'll be honest with you, we don't know. Not with absolute certainty. Not with the kind of proof that would satisfy a court of law or the scientific method. We don't have witness testimony. We don't have the lifeboat. We don't have bodies. All we have are informed guesses based on forensic analysis of a ship examined months after the abandonment. Maybe something else happened. Maybe there's a factor we haven't considered, some detail lost to time, some possibility that seems absurd now, but would make perfect sense if we knew the full context. Maybe Captain Briggs made his decision for reasons we'll never understand. Reasons that weren't recorded in the log, weren't visible in the physical evidence, weren't even comprehensible to anyone who wasn't standing on that deck in that moment. And maybe, and this is the hardest thing to accept, maybe there is no good explanation. Maybe it was simply a convergence of bad circumstances, poor judgment and terrible luck. A perfect storm of wrong decisions and unfortunate timing that resulted in 10 unnecessary deaths. The universe doesn't owe us explanations. Reality doesn't have to make narrative sense. Sometimes things happen for reasons that seem inadequate to the magnitude of the consequences. Sometimes people disappear, and we never learn why, and we have to live with that uncertainty forever. The Mary Celeste forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth. She's a reminder that not everything can be solved, that some mysteries remain mysterious, not because we lack intelligence or technology or investigative skill, but because the evidence simply isn't there anymore. The ocean took it, time eroded it, and we're left with fragments, trying to reconstruct a story from pieces that don't quite fit together. But we try anyway, because that's what humans do. We tell stories, we construct narratives, we impose meaning on chaos, and even when we can't solve a mystery, we can honor the people at its center. We can remember them, we can ensure their names don't disappear as completely as they did. So I'll say their names one more time. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, respected mariner, loving husband, devoted father. Sarah Elizabeth Cobb Briggs, intelligent woman, experienced traveler, mother trying to protect her child. Sophia Matilda Briggs, 2 years old, who never got the chance to grow up. Albert Richardson, first mate. Andrew Gilling, second mate. And the 5 crewmen whose detailed biographies have been lost to history, but whose lives mattered just as much. They boarded the Mary Celeste in New York on November 7th, 1872, expecting a routine 6-week crossing to Italy. They encountered rough weather, navigational challenges, mechanical problems, and ultimately a decision point that would cost them their lives. And somewhere in the Atlantic they died, probably badly, probably scared, probably understanding at the end that they'd made the wrong choice. That's the file. That's the story. That's what happened, as best as we can reconstruct from the evidence available. The Mary Celeste sailed on until Captain Morehouse found her. She was salvaged, investigated, released, and returned to service. She carried cargo for 12 more years before being deliberately wrecked by a captain who saw her only as a tool for fraud. She broke apart on a Caribbean reef and disappeared beneath the waves, her timbers scattered across the ocean floor. And her crew? They're still out there, in a sense. Their atoms returned to the ocean that claimed them. Their story lives in the historical record, in court documents, in newspaper articles, in books and documentaries, and now in this video. They've been remembered in ways they never imagined, for a mystery they never intended to create. If you made it this far, if you've spent this entire hour with me exploring this case, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering these people with me. Thank you for understanding that every mystery is also a tragedy, and every tragedy deserves to be told with respect and care. Subscribe to the Midnight File if you haven't already. There are more stories like this waiting in the archives. More disappearances, more mysteries, more files that refuse to close. And I'll be here in the hours after midnight, when the world is quiet and the past feels closer than it should, opening them one by one. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened. Tell me if you would have stayed aboard or taken the lifeboat. Tell me about other maritime mysteries you want me to investigate. This channel exists because of you, because there are people who appreciate stories that don't have clean endings, who understand that sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. Every town keeps a secret. Every ocean keeps 1,000. The Mary Celeste is just one of them, drifting through history, leaving questions in her wake. The file stays open. The mystery endures, and somewhere in the Atlantic, where the water runs 2 miles deep and the pressure would crush human bones to powder, 10 people rest. They're beyond our reach now, beyond our questions, beyond everything except our memory, so we remember. We tell the story. We honor the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. And the Mary Celeste, after 150 years, still has no intention of giving up her secrets. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the ocean, like history, keeps what it claims. Good night.